Alright, so in this tutorial we're going to build a dropdown. To build a dropdown, you first need to create variants, which specify how each option in your dropdown should look like, depending on which state it's in. So the default state, that's the onHover state, and this is the onSelect state. You could also have an unselected state, but I didn't do this in this example. So we have our dropdown selector, which is going to trigger a open overlay interaction on a frame. And this frame here contains instances of our variants. And that's typically how you would do this in Weebly. So you create variants, you create instances of these variants, and you pack them together inside a frame to be able to tag them with the relevant functionality. So talking about tagging, with the Weebly plugin, there's two parts of this. The first one is selecting our frame with instances of our variants. And the functionality you'll want is either selectable number or selectable text. And that depends on what you want your dropdown to output. So in our case, it will be text. You can then configure how this is going to look and behave. So depending on which variant you want to select, so the default, of course, is default. If I hover on my dropdown option, I want variant 2. And if I select an option, I want variant 3. And then the second part is what data needs to be outputted. So if the user presses on this third button here or the third option here, I want the text third to be outputted, otherwise it's going to be second and first. So that's one part, and the other part, of course, is that typically in a dropdown you want this label here to reflect whatever the user chose there. So I select the label here and I tag it with the text label functionality. So you can already go ahead and publish this. And you'll notice that you have our button here with the overlay opening up, the onHover and onSelect works, but our label isn't updated depending on what we choose. And our overlay only closes when we click outside of it. When we select something, our overlay doesn't close. If you want to configure this, you'll need to go into the Weebly Flow editor, of course, because this is related to how data works in your prototype or in your web application. So let me pull up my editor. Okay, so essentially there are 4 blocks here that are auto-generated. I have my open overlay interaction. So when I click this select button, I open a overlay here. And then I have my text label block assigned to this select label here. And I have my selectable text block, which is relevant for this frame here. And so what you want to do, of course, is link our output of the selectable text to my label here. When I do this, I basically specify, okay, whatever the user chooses here needs to be shown in this label there. If I go ahead and run that prototype, I can now select something and my label will update accordingly. The only thing left to be done, of course, is make sure that when a user selects something, the overlay also closes, because now that only happens when I click outside. To do this, you have a close overlay block in Weebly, where you can select which frame you want to close, and as soon as the block receives a trigger, it will close the specified overlay. So in our case, whenever we choose an option, we want to close the overlay. And when I check my prototype, I can now see that everything works visually. And when I select something, my overlay closes and my label is updated. So you can have simple dropdowns. What we call simple dropdowns, the amount of options here is static. It's determined in your design. But you could also have a case where the options in your dropdown is determined dynamically. So at the time that you're designing, you don't know which option there will be because it will depend on your web application and how users interact with it. So we have a second example here where it's more or less a similar setup. So we have a selector here, it's an open overlay interaction in Figma, and we have a set of options from our variants inside a frame. These options will be populated from a data table. If you don't know what that means in Weebly, there will be a specific tutorial about that as well. Now there's a slight difference in the way that you set this up, in the sense that there's no ability to select variants if you do this dynamically. That's a limitation of Weebly on which we're working. But if you want a dynamic dropdown, you'll need to use the list functionality instead of selectable number or selectable text. So lists will be able to allow you to connect this to a table of dynamic data, basically. So I say, okay, my dropdown will be, the data from a dropdown will be taken from a list. And of course, the way I did it before, this label here is going to be a text label. So let me go ahead and publish this flow. and dive into the flow editor. Okay, so this basically looks a lot like our previous example, meaning that we have our select here, which opens an overlay. We have our text label for the result of whatever the user chooses. But instead of having a selectable text, we now have a list block. If you don't know what that means, there's a separate tutorials on lists and dynamic data in Weebly, which I assume that you've seen before you start this tutorial. So one thing that you'll note about this list block here is that we have an interaction enabled. So if we go back to our design here, you'll notice that our mother components have an interaction specified, which allows us to catch whatever user presses and dynamically go and select the data that's accordingly. What I mean by this is that we have a data table here. So you'll need a data table, of course, if you want to do dynamic dropdowns. We've created an option table with 4 rows, A, B, C, D. This is also the table, of course, from which we'll be using the schema. So in my data table configuration of the list components, I'll use options. And then I need to map my columns onto my design, and basically the label in my options will be taken from the column name, option name. So if we look at it, option name is the only column available, and we'll use the values here to populate our dropdown. So that's it. Of course, we need a actual table of data to show in this list, call it options, and link it like this. So we'll now have a dropdown with the data that we specified in the data table. We of course need to know where the user pressed, on which option the user pressed, and show that in our label here as an end result. And that's what this part is for. So whenever the user presses one of the options, this interaction here will throw out the row in the data table which has been selected. So there's a get row block in Weebly, which of course requires you to specify which data schema you'll be using. Given a row, you will be able to get the option name out of that. So what this says is populate my dropdown with data from the options data table. Whenever the user presses one of the options, get the row from which we've gotten the data, so A, B, C, or D, get that option name from it, and show it in the label. And now I have a dropdown which takes its options from a dynamic table of data. As the table updates, the amount of options will update accordingly. And that's how you build a dropdown from your Figma design dynamically or statically using Weebly.